It's my pleasure to introduce Mike Prados. Probably, if anyone fits the mantra or the saying of requiring no introduction, it's probably Mike. Mike is a professor of pediatrics and neurosurgery at the University of California, San Francisco, and serves as the scientific co-chair of both PNOC and CBTN. This is a very strategic alignment, which has brought about a close collaborative relationship between PNOC and CBTN, which Mike is going to describe for us.
So yeah, thanks very much, and I'll try and get us back on time. But I guess I could spend a lot of time just on this one particular slide. I first was introduced to the CBTN about 4 or 5 years ago and understood how important of a core resource and scientific resource the CBTN was, and Adam asked, how can we think about interacting on the clinical trials standpoint, and that's evolved into what's, I think, a really lovely, amazing, and exciting collaboration between PNOC, which is an early phase clinical trials consortium, and the CBTN. And now we've kind of merged leadership and have integrated, and I hope a really functional way. One thing that I think is important, and what I'm really going to talk about, is what we call the working groups, is the issue of the end product, right? Which is a good clinical trial that actually is meaningful and significant to patients and families. And I don't think people really understand the journey that is taking place to get from an idea to an actual clinical trial, particularly when it involves a rare disease. And I think it's important to kind of reflect a bit about what that really means, and how do you do what's called translational research. In the past and over my career, I think a lot of research ultimately was very, very ad hoc. It was really never strategic in many ways, because it was so dependent on pharmaceutical companies, or even the NCI and CTEP, basically handing down drugs that ultimately we were almost obligated to use in our clinical trials, whether it actually truly met the hypothesis that were being tested in various laboratories across the country. And this kind of approach, I think, has resulted in many, many clinical trials, some of which are duplicative in many ways, but a lot of studies that actually haven't addressed the specific needs and hypotheses that come out of the science that's really amazing from all of these academic institutions. So then you put that together into the framework of rare diseases. And of course, pediatric brain cancer is a rare disease, and all of the specific diseases within brain cancer in children are even more rare. And then it whittles down more and more into an environment where no single institution or no single laboratory, and basically the NCI, cannot manage the complexity of the patient population that we're trying to deal with. And thus the creation of a clinical trial becomes much more difficult over time. So this inconsistency, the ad hoc approach, the kind of hand-me-down structure of how things evolved, I think has been, in my mind, proven to be very inefficient, and probably is the wrong approach. But how do you ultimately then come up with a strategy to improve the clinical trial environment? And one way that we thought was probably better, and a way to at least try and manage this, was to create what we call working groups. So PNOC, about 18 months ago, actually we started talking 2 years ago, was interested in bringing people together that could be much more strategic and forward thinking about that ultimate product. How do we get to a better clinical trial? And we thought that the best way to do this was to actually form groups, team science, if you want to think about it, team science that was not siloed. So what that really implied was that we had to handshake with a lot of different people that had interests in specific diseases, that could come together, work collaboratively in an environment that would allow them to actually think creatively, and then reach out to our pharmaceutical partners or the NCI to say, here is what we have, this is what we need, can you provide that for us, on an ongoing, iterative, longitudinal process. So the kind of the mission of these working groups was to bring together clinical scientists and laboratory scientists with advocates, with the people who actually, and the families who actually have the strongest vested interest in how a clinical trial is developed and how the process is put into place to accelerate that. So that's exactly what the working groups are. This is a collaborative effort, disease specific, that brings together that expertise, the advocacy expertise, the scientists who do the laboratory work, and the clinicians who put that all together into a clinical trial, talking and integrating all of that effort with the stakeholders, the people who really matter, and that's the patients and families. So the mission of the working groups is very simple, is to be translational, and to do that by bringing clinicians, scientists, philanthropies together, and to develop the very best trial possible based on preclinical testing. And we wanted that testing to be done in an environment that was not siloed at all. Everybody's invited to the table. So that means laboratories across the globe with investigators who really care about what they're doing, all talking together on a regular basis about what we should do. What are the next steps? How do we validate the findings that we have in the lab? How do we move that towards an idea for a clinical trial, and how do we fund that? And in order to do that, we have to bring a lot of disciplines together as well that could help support that effort, again, in a strategic, forward-thinking way. And that includes, obviously, the biorepository of CBTN, which is critical to look at a vast repository of information from patients that are annotated, that have biology that's well constructed and easy to view, to talk about imaging scientists and neuropathologists and people who think very carefully about quality of life, functional outcomes, and all of the elements that should go into a clinical trial. So the next slide, I guess, Angela, yeah, there you go. So what that evolved with was the creation of these disease working groups. And initially they were very much disease focused. So you can see the list that we have here: ATRT, craniopharyngioma, high-grade glioma, ependymoma, low-grade glioma, medullo. And then that's evolved to what Cassie talked about. Now we have the DEI working group. We also have a germ cell working group. We have an ETMR emerging working group. We have an immunotherapy working group. And this has actually increased our repertoire of interaction and collaboration in a way that all of the working groups basically are interacting with each other in a very meaningful way. And I'll point out how that's actually happening, for instance, in the low-grade glioma working group. So these working groups meet on a regular basis. Each one has their own character and culture, which is really fun when you go into that. But all of them are embedded with clinical scientists and laboratory scientists, as well as the advocates who meet with them on a regular basis, so that they can view and see how things are done, what the process is, the decision-making and the prioritization that goes into saying, okay, now we've got something and we've got to move it forward. Next slide. So one example of this is, I'm just going to bring up one because there's so many working groups, and I just think it's important to kind of take a glimpse very easily. So for medulloblastoma, Rob Rechawaya and Tab are running this group. Next slide. And you can see the working group team members. So just to give you a sense of it, most working groups have between 10, 20, some have even more participants that involve, again, all of those disciplines that we talked about and the disease champions. And that's a small list that we have right here for this particular working group. The disease champions are embedded into the group so that they are listening, learning, and contributing aspects of issues that, again, are important on that side of the decision-making process. So this working group is very robust. It meets on a regular basis. Next slide, Angela. And they've decided on the way that they're doing things is to have a number of topic discussions that I've just listed the recent ones that they've had over the last 12 months that inform everybody and help to excite everybody, because each one of these projects brings new ideas. And these new ideas then get embedded into new decision-making strategies that go through it. But at the end of the day, we want to develop good clinical trials and fund them in a way that seems to address the high unmet need, for instance, in the focus for this, which is recurrent medulloblastoma, but also to think about how to bring that up into upfront strategies. So each one of these topics generates a lot of discussion and ideas and cross-fertilization that can help inform therapy decisions. Next slide. And embedded also, and I think this is really the critical collaborative effort that the CBTN brings into it, is that each of the working groups gets an update on a regular basis of what's available in the CBTN to help inform the clinical and laboratory scientists about data and information that could help support the development of new clinical trials. And this is just one of the reports that's given after each one of these meetings showing the resources. For instance, in medulloblastoma, 476 patients enrolled. That's a lot of patient information and a lot of data that could help, again, to add to the decision-making process for the clinical trials that come through. So these kinds of reports they come out after every one of the working group meetings. It's an awful lot of work to put all this together, but it's really critical in order to help support the decision-making process that goes on. Next slide. And in the medullo trial, so a medullo working group, for instance, there are two clinical trials that are just about ready to go that actually have been funded by philanthropy. And I mean, these are not the kinds of studies that we can get support from the NCI with. They're very early phase, their feasibility, their discovery in many ways, but they should inform more efficacy studies as we go forward. And a shout out to the philanthropy groups, because one of the studies that involves the treatment of a biopsy strategy, we actually asked the community whether they would help support discussions with various IRBs to kind of get over the hurdle of the issues about doing that kind of a strategy of a biopsy treat biopsy approach. And they provided letters and support that we can use when we go to the IRBs when these trials are discussed. So that's a real strong message, I think, that the working groups are truly working groups and they involve all the constituents. Next slide. And those two studies have been supported by a large number of philanthropy. This would never happen, I think, unless there was a place, an environment, a sandbox, if you will, where people can come together freely on a regular basis, where everybody knows what the trajectory is and how things are being done and can contribute equally into the process. Next slide. So just to let you know, over the last 18 months since we really started this, there's been an awful lot of effort. A lot of people have already heard about DMG Act, which is a huge collaborative effort with multiple laboratories across the globe supporting now 2 clinical trials that have come out of that working group. Cassie's group has now developed a trial that has just recently been fully funded with craniopharyngioma, another rare disease, which are a really important clinical trial looking at functional endpoints in addition to the biological endpoints. The two trials I just talked about for medulloblastoma, the imaging working group now has embedded itself in PNOC-21, which is a phase 1 combinatorial low-grade glioma clinical trial, looking at a novel PET tracer, which is really going to be exciting and adding new information to biodiscovery there. The ATRT working group just finished decision-making about a registry that we hope to embed with the CBTN and other support groups, plus a therapeutic trial. You just heard about the DEI manuscript, and there will be a review from the imaging working group to look at PNOC outcomes on imaging and correlating that with new RAPNO guidelines. So this has been a total success story. I think it's a critically important one. It actually is translation that works and is, I think, a highlight of what the opportunities are. And of course, there's still challenges, but the opportunities there are when people come together freely, without any kinds of embargoes, that are willing to work together, and everybody is, to develop, which is ultimately what we want, which is a good clinical trial that changes outcome. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Let me just make one comment briefly, Angela. You know, with Mike, it's something we take for granted, but I just wanted to double down on something Mike mentioned, which is, you know, these working groups, we piloted these efforts, you know, through interaction between CBTN and PNOC, but the working groups are not restricted to those two consortia memberships. So we have members from PBTC, Poetic, Connect, COG. The infrastructure of PNOC and CBTN have provided a context for these working groups, but there's no requirement or mandate for specific membership into the consortia. You just have to have will and zeal for collaborative focus together as a group. So I just wanted to just touch on the comment you made, Mike.
Yeah, and I just want to add one other thing too, that the strength of the working groups, particularly because of the success, also resonates with biopharma. And they understand now that the working groups represent the diversity of expertise that pharma does not have, that actually informs them and can help support how they deal with the RACE Act, for instance. And I think this is actually becoming much more of a frequent request now from pharma. How can we access this great expertise? I think it's been also another success story about that kind of communication as well.